Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to those from the Waimakariri. Great to see you again. And from those who aren't from the Waimak, welcome. Good to see you. Make sure you do come back another time and visit and spend more of your money in the local economy. It's a real honour and privilege to be the local MP for the Waimakariri. For me, not only is it about being accessible, which I work hard to be, it's ensuring that I engage in the issues that are relevant to the people that I represent. And I think this topic of end-of-life choice bill is relevant to the people of Waimakariri, but also of Canterbury and the whole of New Zealand as we grapple with this issue. Can I start by welcoming our guest speakers? The Right Honourable Sir Bill English, Dr. Kate Grundy, David Seymour, and Garba Rietma. Been a bit of a political junkie, just as a bit of a side. I'm quite excited about tonight, purely because as we've had discussions in the crowd in the last few minutes, there's actually not that much opportunity to have a debate these days and discuss the real issues, and I'm really excited about that. So as you'd imagine, we're going to follow a debate structure. Each team, the against team, the for team, will have about 25 minutes between the two speakers. I will introduce them with a brief bio for each before they speak. Also, as an MP, one thing I'm sure I do is respect other people's views and ensure that their views are valued. And I do ask you tonight to ensure, over the course of the debate and at the end when we invite you to ask questions, to respect everyone else's views as well. Okay, let's jump into it. We're going to start off with David Seymour. David is a current ACT Member of Parliament. Well, he's actually the leader of the ACT party in Parliament, who is responsible for the end-of-life choice bill. He has been a strong advocate of euthanasia and first entered the bill into the ballot in 2015. More recently, David is well known for his feats out of Parliament and on the dance floor, finishing in 5th place in Dancing with the Stars last year. What I didn't mention earlier was that I'll ring a bell with 2 minutes to go. Please welcome David Seymour.
Thank you. It's forecast that I'm going to live down Dancing with the Stars sometime in the 2030s. People won't introduce me that way anymore, but look, I want to thank Matt for putting this on. This is one of the biggest crowds. This is the 28th of these meetings that I've done, literally from Kerikeri to Gore, and this is one of the biggest crowds, and it's been interesting to go around and talk to different people and ask them about Matt, and everyone says that they feel they've got a sincere local MP, and I can tell you that shines and reflects from him in Parliament too. So thank you, Matt. Thank you to both sides of the debate for being here tonight, and thank all of you for giving up your time for what I regard as a very important issue. And I'd just like to start by saying that there's really ultimately one question that this debate boils down to, and it's, should somebody have to suffer for someone else's morality? That's the simple question. But we're going to go through quite a lot of detail before we get to that. And really, there's two questions you've got to answer first, which is the current status quo acceptable? Are people currently suffering? And if you agree with that, then you might be a supporter of the end-of-life choice bill. The second question, though, is it possible to design a regime or a set of laws that will give choice to those who want it while protecting those who want nothing to do with it? And if I can persuade you, and Gabe can help persuade you of that second part, then you are likely a supporter of the end-of-life choice bill. And really, the only remaining question is whether you think somebody should be forced to suffer for somebody else's morality. And what I mean by that, let me just start by saying that there's about 200 people in this room. And the good news is that 90% of you are going to have a good death. You'll get, hopefully, a little bit optimistic, but get to 100 years old, die in your sleep, and everyone will come along and say what a good guy or girl you were. And then there'll be some people in the room who will find themselves at the end of their life struggling. Maybe they have a terminal illness like cancer, maybe they have some sort of degenerative condition that has plagued them for some time, but they'll get to the stage where things aren't looking so good. They're certainly not going to die of a heart attack in the sleep the way we'd all like to. And the good news is that palliative care is a wonderful thing. Some people think that if you support this bill, you're against palliative care and vice versa. That's not true, they're complementary. And so chances are that you will actually be helped by wonderful people in hospices and the medical profession who can help you die well even if you have a complicated end. And that's great. But then there's a percent or two of people, maybe 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 people in this room of 200, who find yourselves at the end of your life not coping and unable to be helped in a way you find satisfactory by palliative care. And I just want to pause for a moment and say that that is a fact that was accepted uncontested by both sides in the Lucretia Seals versus Attorney General court case. Not everybody can be helped by palliative care, wonderful as it is. So you can be a supporter of palliative care and say it's great and we should have more of it, and I think that too, but still accept it can't help everyone. And if you are in that small group of people left over, then you face some pretty ugly choices. In Carter versus Canada, the landmark ruling by the Supreme Court of Canada, which led to assisted dying being legalised in that country, they called it the cruel choice. The choice between suffering and agony and basically batting it out to the bitter end with whatever help is available, but suffering quite badly. We've had a lot of people come to meetings like this up and down the country and share experiences like that. I think maybe one of the reasons why 3/4 of New Zealanders consistently say to reputable scientific public opinion polls that they support legalisation of assisted dying is because so many of us have had experiences like that. So that's an option. You just bat it out. You just suffer. An option that might go with that some people have taken is that they refuse food or water. They starve themselves to death. Remember, there's no safeguards around those sorts of choices. Another option that surveys of doctors have confirmed does occur, and some opponents of the end-of-life choice bill happily go along with, is that a doctor does it for you. They give you a bit too much painkiller perhaps, and if they had the intention of alleviating pain and you happen to die, that's called the double effect, and that's okay. No safeguards. In theory, you don't even have to be awake. That's okay under the status quo. So that is a reality for some people. Probably the grittiest option of all, and I make no apology for this. When Bill and I were down in Gore, we had a woman, a pretty tough farming lass who had her father do this in a wool shed in a farm out in Southland. People that take their own lives, and there's evidence that between 3 and 8% of suicides by the elderly are not people who are depressed or upset or want to die. They're people who want to live, but they know they are dying, and they take it into their own hands in a violent, amateur fashion. That's what the Supreme Choice of Canada called the cruel choices that people actually face. So that is my argument for why the status quo is not acceptable for people who find themselves in that position. It's only a few percent, but I think those people matter. The second question is whether or not it's possible to design a regime that will give choice to those who want it and protection and safety for those who want nothing to do with it. And I wouldn't mind if I can ask, for people just to pick up that sheet that's been distributed. It's got a series of blue circles down one side, and it takes you through the steps. Because I was talking to people in the crowd, they said, you just walk into a hospital, off you go, whoops. It's a bit more rigorous than that. And the first test is, are you 18? So written in statute is, are you 18? And some people say, oh, that'll change, people will go to court and have the rules change. I can tell you, if it was possible to go to court and change a law about the age in New Zealand, then I would have been driving at 12 and drinking at 14. The fact is that it says in the law, that we propose to pass at least, that you've got to be 18. The second thing is, are you a New Zealand citizen or a permanent resident? Not hugely important, but it's a signal that we want this to be for New Zealanders. So we're not going to become like Switzerland, like where that Aussie guy travelled just a couple of days ago. We're not there for a sort of medical tourism. This is a choice for New Zealanders. If other people want to legalise assisted dying, and by the way, there's now about 150 million people in America and Canada and Netherlands and Belgium and Australia who do have legalised assisted dying in their country or province or state. If other countries want to join them, that's fine, but this is for New Zealanders. The third thing is, do you have a medical condition? So you can't just be having a bad day. You've actually got to be diagnosed with a medical condition. It either has to be terminal within 6 months, or you have to have a grievous and irremediable condition. And some people say, well, gee, I don't know about that second one. I can understand people that are terminal, but what about just someone with a grievous or irremediable condition? I mean, that could be someone with, like my cousin who has Down syndrome, for example. That could be just someone who's, somehow disabled. Well, that would be terrible, and that's not what the bill says, and that's why we have number 4, which is you've got to be in an advanced state of irreversible decline in capability. So it's not just having a certain level of ability, it's being in an advanced state of irreversible decline. All of this, by the way, has to be signed off by 2 doctors independently selected from each other. The 5th criteria is that you have to understand the decision that you're making. So you can't be somebody who has some sort of mental problem that stops you understanding what you're doing, that you've been taken advantage of. You have to actually have the mental capacity, as judged by 2 doctors, and if either of those doctors are uncertain, they're obliged to refer you to a psychiatrist for a 3rd opinion. So you start to get the feeling this is pretty rigorous stuff. So there you have a robust set of criteria that actually test whether or not a person is able to be, first of all, qualified as having a medical condition. Second of all, whether a person has the mental capacity, all of which checks by 2 doctors, documented and recorded by the Ministry of Health. It's a pretty rigorous regime. And you'll hear a lot of terrible things about what's happened overseas. But I just want to leave you with a couple more thoughts on whether or not it's possible to design a regime. The first is that when you introduce a bill like this, the Attorney General gets advice from Crown Law, the people that are basically the government's lawyers. Is this consistent with the Bill of Rights Act? And Crown Law have said that yes, this is indeed consistent with the Bill of Rights Act. It doesn't violate the right not to be deprived of life because people are making their own decision. It doesn't deprive people of the right to freedom of expression because doctors can opt out and people are making their own decision. So all of this has been checked by Crown Law and they say it's consistent with the Bill of Rights of New Zealand. Secondly, in Carter versus Canada, which I would say is the most robust examination of assisted dying laws around the world in an English-speaking, democratic Western country that we generally respect, the Supreme Court of Canada said that yes, indeed, they believe, having examined the evidence, it is perfectly possible to deliver a bill that gives choice to those who want it and protects those who want nothing to do with it. And finally, if you look around the world, this is something that is being reinforced by jurisdiction after jurisdiction. It's kind of interesting, just as an aside, quite a number of jurisdictions have had bills before their parliament, and their politicians have been scared out of passing them. but not one of them that has an assisted dying law has ever gone back. And that is perhaps the ultimate, I guess, credit or proof that actually, once you have one of these bills in place, it is perfectly possible for people to use it if they want to, and be protected if they don't, around the world. And so I leave you with two prospects. One is that if you look through the options that those few people who find themselves ill at the end of their life can't be helped by palliative care, if you look through the options those people face, then, you know, I don't think it's acceptable. I don't think it's humane for our society to leave people in the situation we do. And I think we need change. Secondly, if you look around the world at the evidence in the Supreme Court of Canada, from our own Crown law, from the Australian states whose parliaments have been examining this in depth recently, there's no question that it's possible to design such a law, and that the end-of-life choice bill currently before the ballot, before Parliament, is one of those bills. Now, the final thing I'll leave you with is that if you accept the status quo as unacceptable, and if you accept it's possible to do better, then really the only question left is a moral question. Is it right for some people, the most vulnerable people, in a free society such as ours, to be forced by the law to suffer to satisfy the morality of others? And I would put it to you that it is not, and it is essential that your MP and all of my colleagues in Parliament vote to make this bill a law. Thank you very much.
Okay, I'll be calling next Dr. Kate Grundy to speak as the first speaker against the bill. Dr. Kate Grundy has been the Clinical Director of Palliative Care at the Christchurch Hospital Palliative Care Service for nearly 20 years. She holds other roles including lecturer at the Christchurch School of Medicine and Medical Director of the Nurse Maud Hospice. Kate is passionate about ensuring care and services are available to help patients in their whānau when they are facing life-limiting illness and at the time of death, whenever that might be. Please welcome Dr. Kate Grundy.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak, and thanks, Matt, for the introduction. Tonight, I'm going to be drawing on my 30-year career as a doctor and the experience from that. The moot, you know, is that the end-of-life choice bill should be passed in the House of Representatives. I'm representing the negative and will concentrate on why I believe we shouldn't legislate for assisted dying, which is a collective term for both euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide. My co-speaker for the negative will talk more about why the bill before Parliament, we believe, is so deeply flawed and problematic. For the majority of my career, I've been privileged to care for many hundreds of people at the very ends of their lives, and for the people who love and care for them. Much of my time is spent providing education and support to ensure that the rest of the healthcare workforce is equipped with the necessary skills to look after dying patients with confidence, expertise, and compassion. We only die once, and we deserve to be looked after by people who know what they're doing. Ultimately, dying is normal, natural, and inevitable. We are devastated when our loved ones die, and this is magnified further when the death is due to unnatural events such as accidents, murders, or suicide. Normal dying is often distressing, and it can be really hard, but that's by no means the normal way of things. David did mention that. Oftentimes, dying is extremely painful. Oftentimes, dying is extremely peaceful, dignified, and timely. Like snow falling, the words of a loving father who was holding his beloved 3-year-old when he died of a brain tumor. It can be a beautiful thing, and striving for that to happen as often as possible is my life's work. I'd like to tell you about some of the people that I care for. Humans are incredible fighters. It's normal to fight. It's instinctive. Increasingly, people hold our health system to account. They want to be sure that they've got every opportunity to be given the latest and the best treatments to prolong and enhance their lives. And billions of dollars are spent to improve our chances of getting more time. Many keep fighting literally to the bitter end. We marvel at how people find their strength and the will to keep living. And even if euthanasia were legalized, it would never enter their heads to request it. Onlookers, family members, friends often have a very different view. And I'm sensing that they're really imagining what it might be like for them if they were in that position. So it's against this backdrop that I outline why I believe some doctors support assisted dying and what I understand them to be referring to when they say that euthanasia is already happening in New Zealand. I refute the assertion that doctors are regularly practicing euthanasia. Dying patients are treated with symptom-relieving medications, including sedatives, if these are required. When these medications are used correctly, it is good clinical practice, and it would be inhumane and unethical to withhold such treatments on the off chance that they shortened that person's life by a few minutes, hours, or maybe even days. This practice is often referred to as assisted dying, and it is not correct. This is the area of medicine that I'm trained in, that I practice every day, and I teach others to do with skill and care. The other misunderstanding is the issue of treatment withdrawal. This can be legally be undertaken as per a patient's wishes or without their input, but in the context of a principle referred to as best interests. Examples include the withdrawal of antibiotics, artificial feeding, kidney dialysis, ventilation in the intensive care, or a myriad of other treatments started with good intent, but over time they've become burdensome or futile rather than beneficial. Withdrawal of such treatments are a patient's right. It is totally permissible under current law, and treatment withdrawal is not euthanasia. So why do some doctors feel they're already practicing euthanasia? Some of it is ignorance, but most of it, I believe, is fear. At the core is the fact that doctors are ordinary citizens too. We hold the full range of beliefs, values, cultural practices, fears, as everyone else. Doctors don't often go into medicine to focus on caring for the dying. They hope to extend life, to postpone death, to cure, to break new ground. So when they encounter the reality of failed treatments, progressive disability, and inevitable decline, they can often feel powerless. It's hard to sit with sadness and grief. You need to have faced your own mortality to help your patients make sense of what is happening to them and to help them cope. But that's what we must all do. It is part of living in a compassionate society that values everyone and helps each person to make the very most of the time that they have left. I believe that most doctors, when caring for a person in their last days, occasionally find themselves wanting it all to be over. And I have felt that myself from time to time. Some, however, lack the necessary skills to ensure the best possible palliative care. They often try to manage cases on their own, leaving themselves burdened with inadequacy and guilt. They don't know what they don't know. They can inadvertently project their own fears of death onto patients and caregivers, and over-medicating can seem like the only solution. But it's a really complex area. These are actively dying patients, most often with impaired consciousness, and an exact prognosis is incredibly hard to predict. Their family members, too, may be exhausted. So these are not the situations that we think of when we're discussing a legal framework. Think of all those steps David referred to. You can't do all those steps when someone is literally dying in your presence. The framework consists of routine consultations, competency assessments, and the administration of a concoction of drugs that are not in use in our health system currently. So we'll be asking doctors to go into utterly uncharted territory, to deliberately end a life when death is actually some distance away. As far as I am aware, this is absolutely not happening in New Zealand today. Conversations about death and dying are some of the hardest we undertake in medicine. As I said before, most doctors are in the business to cure and extend life. Compassion, communication, bedside manner, openness, gentleness, they're all essential, and we need to focus more on teaching and valuing these skills. So our response to these gaps is, in my view, improved family and caregiver support, better access to education for health professionals, and specialist end-of-life care if it's needed, not euthanasia. Personally, I believe that euthanasia is actually a construct of Western privileged cultures. It is an anathema to many cultures where life is regarded as a gift. This is nothing to do with religion per se, but to require the security of euthanasia is essentially about the desire for control, order, and above all, an expectation of absolute personal autonomy. Many cultures have a system of shared decision-making and collective care of the frail and the sick. We should judge our society by how well it cares for and values the vulnerable. And I vehemently reject that our wonderful pluralistic society should hold autonomy as its ultimate ethical principle. I must add, however, that palliative care does not and never will have all the answers. That's the reality. Sometimes palliative care input is not appropriate, and sometimes, despite our very best efforts, the person's distress cannot be alleviated. These cares are mercifully rare in my experience. But each one is heartbreaking, and regardless of whether assisted dying is permitted, we cannot erase suffering. It is part and parcel of the human condition. On a positive note, just last week, our government launched a publicity campaign for advanced care planning. This is where people develop and document their wishes and preferences for future healthcare. They do this together with their loved ones and ideally a trusted health professional to ensure that they're competent and that any directives that are written down are in a way that can be understood and honoured when that person can no longer speak for themselves. I've been a strong supporter of ACP for over 10 years when it was first recognised in New Zealand, and have come across many people who have been able to let go of their desire for euthanasia legislation because they now have confidence that their wishes will be heard. ACP puts the power back with the person, not the system, where it rightfully belongs. Legalising euthanasia would be a catastrophe. Families are complicated. Families barely agree about where to eat Christmas dinner or which movie to see at the cinema, never mind about a decision to prematurely end the life of a precious family member. Just because someone has decided it's right for them doesn't mean that everyone will feel the same. Many of those loved ones may not even know it is happening, and that's a provision explicitly stated in the law or the bill. I've become increasingly aware that in countries where euthanasia is legal, skills around care of the dying are being lost. Their health and social systems don't really try anymore to maximise quality of life and relieve suffering. Pressure, possibly unconsciously, to consider assisted dying is often applied to those with high care needs. I believe that that's a horrific situation. It says that as a society, productivity, usefulness, and wellness are valued over our unique worth as human beings to receive care, support, and love when we most need it. I'll finish with a word of caution. 18 months ago, I spent 6 weeks in Canada when medical assistance in dying had recently been legalised. I spoke to an oncologist who had volunteered to participate on a panel to review the requests of cancer patients. He was quite shocked by the numbers that came forward, but he was even more shocked by why. Many patients were essentially saying that they wanted a health system that was able to guarantee a skilled workforce to care for them and their families at the end of life. They also wanted the opportunity to talk openly and honestly with health professionals about dying and about their end-of-life fears, wishes, and preferences without being pushed away. This comes right back to the universal need for expertise in palliative care and communication skills. Most palliative care clinicians are against assisted dying, not because we have a pecuniary interest in perpetuating suffering, quite the opposite. The only narrative I hear in New Zealand around death and dying is euthanasia. Really? Are we that frightened about the one thing we must all face eventually? I petition our government to reject assisted dying. Instead, we must ensure that 1, specialist palliative care is adequately funded everywhere, especially in our acute hospitals and our aged care facilities. 2, that health care professionals are adequately trained in basic palliative care and in communication skills, and they are resourced appropriately to provide that care. And 3, we stop regarding death as a failure and as the enemy. Thank you.
Our next speaker for the bill, the second speaker for the bill, is Garba Riepma. The team so far, David spoke for 13 minutes, so Garba, you'll have 12. Garba is based in Christchurch and is the Senior Director of Health and Social Services at Microsoft Asia. Having lived all over Asia throughout the 18 years so far with Microsoft, Garba has returned to his hometown of North Canterbury to utilise his global experience in the health sector. Garba is an advocate for euthanasia and is passionate about the opportunities technology can provide to promote change and efficiency in the health sector. Please welcome Garba Riepma.
All right. Hey, well, it's great to be here, and it's always difficult to come after a spokesperson from a customer who I absolutely love and adore, who do amazing things for looking after our loved ones in the palliative care space. And as much as I'm pro-euthanasia, I'm also pro-palliative care, as much as you might like to think that might be an acronym, but it's certainly not. The reason I wanted to come and really speak today, and I know this room is strongly divided across both of you. I think in some of you are deeply against euthanasia and deeply see it as a challenging subject, and you see it as wrong. And I think you're right. And at the same time, probably the other half of the room, maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less, see euthanasia as something about your choice, something that you need to be able to make, something that you need to be in control of, even if you choose not to use it. And you are also right. Now, the negative team today has told you it's right or wrong, and I don't believe there is a right or wrong in this debate. I think that the debate is really only about one thing. It's about choice, and empowering all of you, every single one of you, with the choice and opportunity to be able to make the decisions for your life in the way that you want to, rather than have the state control or decide what you should do. Now, that's the great thing about choice. The great thing about choice is you get to say yes and you get to say no. Even if you were permitted to say, to choose, you could also say no, and you could also say yes. And if you said yes, as David has outlined, there is a long process to go through to ensure there is enough protection in there so that your choice can be respected and honoured. And I think that's a really important thing about what this debate is about. This debate for me is not about whether euthanasia is right or wrong, whether I would choose it or decline it. It's about whether I'm given the choice to be able to make that decision in the best of my ability and be able to see that through just as I would any other choice in my life. And you might call me crazy, and you might say, why would you do that to yourself? You're mad. And I might be. But I think it's not really about that, and I will explain in my story a little bit later about how that happens. This debate is also about something else. That's something else that I think is very important. And just as palliative care provides a great amount of dignity to those who choose to not have euthanasia and choose to see their life through, and the palliative care nurses and doctors and people that do this work are some of the most amazing people in the medical field. They deal every day with the dying. But at the same time, there is an aspect of dignity that is so incredibly important that we also need to respect. And we need to think about that in the context of those who don't have a voice, those who may not be here and struggling, people who are trapped in bodies that no longer function, people that are trapped in the confines of a space that you and I might never hope happens to us, trapped in bodies that can no longer verbalize properly, can no longer swallow or chew, bodies that no longer decide when to pass motion, bodies that have a mind of their own and are no longer controlled by the mind. This is about dignity. This choice that we're making here as a country is about dignity. It's about giving people the dignity and the ability to make their own choice. This debate is not about the judgment of others or of special interest groups with a loud voice. It's about giving dignity and respect. It's about empowering all of us to decide on our own journey in the best way possible, in the way that it's meaningful for us. And that means if you choose to live through the end, like my wonderful grandfather did, who passed away a week ago in the Netherlands, he had that choice and he made that choice and he was comfortable with that choice. And as a deeply pious man in a country that has legalized euthanasia, he was cared for as wonderful as anyone else. But the great thing about my grandfather, and the thing that he always appreciated the most, is that he had a choice to be able to make that happen. If there's one thing I care about in this debate, and I care deeply about this, it's about giving a voice to the voiceless in this debate. All of us up on the stage are perfectly able-bodied, giving our stories, giving our sermons, giving our talks about why we should or shouldn't have euthanasia in this country. But through this, we miss the weak, we miss the marginalised, we miss the people who don't have a voice in this debate, the people who are sitting in their wheelchairs right now without an ability to speak, to be able to make that decision. Giving a voice to the people who can't hold placards, who can't hold placards in the street, to the people who don't have a pulpit, to the people who don't have a debating chamber where they can argue whether this is right or wrong. These are the people that deserve a voice. These are the people who deserve to be able to make it. These are the people that don't have a megaphone like we do here today to shout at, but these are the people who are crying out to be given a choice on their journey. Now, I would like to tell you about a journey that's deeply personal to me, a journey I've shared as a passenger since about 1998. In 1998, in a very cold Christchurch winter night with a chilly wind that you can only just imagine, I went into a bar and ordered a drink, and a few minutes later, a beautiful girl came across to me, and she said, "Hi, I'm Rachel." And it was amazing, and I met Rachel, and we had a wonderful time talking about all of life and all of journeys, and months later, she invited me to move to Sydney and join her, and I did. And I would later marry this girl and have a wonderful life with her over many years and have a very special experience with her. But unfortunately, before we were married, at the age of 24, we got pregnant. And when we got pregnant, we knew that there was always going to be a challenge because her biological father had died of Huntington's disease in St. John of God here in Christchurch. Now, Huntington's disease, for those of you who don't know, is a genetic condition which is passed 50-50 down to their children. It's terminal, it causes immense degenerative problems, and it's probably one of the life's cruel diseases, and there are many, but this is one of those cruel ones that you just wish no one ever had. Pregnant at 24, we went through huge amounts of counselling, genetic counselling, screening, and so forth to go and do the tests, and Rachel said, "I want to do these tests because I want to be able to make the right choice." And so we did, and we trundled off to Westmead, and we got the tests done. And I remember distinctly one afternoon, late on a Canberra hot summer's day where I was working in the Department of Defence, I got a call from Rachel, and she said, I remember it to this day, she goes, "I've got the gene." I raced back, right? I got in the car and drove to Sydney as fast as you could possibly drive. Probably my own form of euthanasia was quite at risk there. But silly as it was, I remember walking and racing up the stairs and seeing her and grabbing her and having to make the tough choices in life that we sometimes do. And we had to make a choice over the coming weeks about whether we were going to abort our unborn child, because the risk of her knowing she was going to die and the child was going to die was something that we could no longer bear. Now, here's the funny thing about that decision. You make a decision about an unborn child's life, but you can't make a decision about your own. And arguably, to a certain extent, that is what this debate is about. It's a tough debate. It's a hard one. But the other wonderful thing about being and knowing that you're going to die, which is a sort of funny thing because no one wants to be told that they're going to die, is you could plan and you could make journeys and you could make your life amazing, and so we did. And we had the best journey that we could ever have for many years together. And she's been in a care home now for 7 or 8 years, and I go there regularly to feed her and clean her, and my parents do her nails. But she's been adamant for 16 years that she wants the right to choose. She wants the right to decide about how it is for her, and she doesn't want other people telling her, and she doesn't want to be told, no, you can't. If you met Rachel, you'd understand. And you'd want to give her a choice. And she is one of those voiceless that is underrepresented in this debate and underrepresented in the challenges that we all face in our lives and how we want to go about them. This is also for people that have been deeply impacted in my life. Marjorie Abernathy, who had multiple sclerosis, committed suicide using a car and carbon monoxide poisoning in her vehicle not 200 metres from our house. She was a dear neighbour, but in the incomparable suffering of multiple sclerosis in her life, she decided to take her own life. This is for Karen, a resident who lives with Rachel at the Huntington's home here in Christchurch, who decided she couldn't do it anymore and decided to starve herself. And we watched her starve herself over 6 weeks under the guidance of an advanced care directive that the staff were not allowed to feed her anymore. But that's not what Rachel wants to do. That's not how Rachel wants to go. It's also for Adam, who also lives in the same home. And you can see there's a litany of people here and voiceless people whose story never gets told. Adam accidentally, though, not through any fault of his own or maybe a decision of his own, but he burnt to death in a care home that just provides great care. But he burnt himself to death in a hopeless disease that makes it difficult. This is for Rachel, who I told you about. This is for Lucretia Seals, who died of a brain tumour. This is for Bobby Carroll, who's suffering from multiple myeloma. She supports choice. She wants the right to die, even if she wouldn't choose to use it. And even David Seymour, not this David Seymour, who's been recently diagnosed with motor neuron disease, also wants to have the choice. So all in all, the way I want you to think about this debate and the way I want you to think about euthanasia, this is not about right or wrong. This is not about whether you should or shouldn't, or whether we should coerce people into doing it. This is crazy. This is about empowering the individuals, empowering the voiceless, to build a more compassionate New Zealand, a compassionate New Zealand we can all be proud of, where the individual does have an ability to choose, and if they choose not to want to die from euthanasia, they have an incredible healthcare system that will look after them and care for them and hold their hand on that journey. Thank you very much.
Originally from Lumsden, Bill served in New Zealand politics for 28 years after being elected in 1990 as the national candidate for Wallace. Sir Bill has staunchly advocated against euthanasia and vehemently opposed the bill during its first reading in the House back in 2007. Please welcome who I used to call boss, Sir Bill English.
Well, thank you very much, Matt. And can I start, Gabe, by acknowledging all your support and care for someone you obviously love over many years with many challenges and difficult decisions. Because it does bring us to the nub of this debate, of which I think there are two. One is whether anyone's choice is only for them or affects the rest of us. And secondly, to answer David's question about whether it's possible to devise a safe law where some people can make a choice and it doesn't affect anyone else. A couple of weeks ago, my sons were upset to find that a friend of theirs who'd had actually a reasonably hard life but was making some success killed himself. A choice, personal autonomy. A young man who decided in his mid-20s that he had had enough of life. But I don't think any of us would believe that that choice had no effect on anybody else. Of course it did. And the people around that young man had exactly the reaction you would expect. That is, their concern that the choice he made, as far too many others do, to kill himself, would have the effect of making other young people in more difficult circumstances more likely to make the same choice. We don't make these choices on our own. Imagine if your mother went through this process, which I'll come back to, and you find out a week after she was killed, euthanized, that it happened. Imagine that. Is that a choice of no consequence? What do you think you would feel about your mother's view on life if she'd never said to you she wanted to be euthanized? But she quietly went off, went through this, doctor didn't have to speak to you or the family, no one knew. And that's not hypothetical, it's what this is designed around, the choice of an autonomous individual. Well, there might be some other family who say, that's great, because we'll inherit sooner, or that's great. Well, these are families. Who knows about families? Well, just about everybody, because we're all in one. Or that's great. She used to argue with me all the time and never accepted me. These are the discussions that go on around dying, and there might be some who say, that is awful, because it makes me feel like I was not looking after her. One way or another, it's unlikely that the family will head off to the rugby game on Saturday afternoon, start planning their Christmas holidays and not think about it again because they'll say, oh, that was just mum making her own choice. And we know with this bill that is how other people have seen it too. You see, just for instance, if it's such a great idea that has no effect on everybody else, why has the disability community fought so hard to get out from under this piece of legislation? They don't, and I'll tell you why, and in a way it's pretty obvious, isn't it? They don't want to be classified as having conditions where perhaps they should think about someone killing them. Because that's the mechanics of the bill. If you meet the criteria, then the state will sanction someone to kill you if you choose it. If you don't meet the criteria, then that doesn't happen. So they've worked pretty hard to get out from under it for a very sensible, reasonable rationale that if they're on that list, regarded as living lives that could be terminated, killed under licence, that somehow that diminishes them. And you know what? They're right. there is no way in which their lives are enhanced by that. And I don't think a single person in this room would believe it. And, you know, these things aren't simple. So how do we say to the anorexic 18-year-old girl who is starving herself to death, you're going to die soon, so no, how can we say to them now, we'll do everything we can to turn your life around? And then we're going to pass this bill where we'll say to her, well, you fit a set of criteria, which means you can ask for euthanasia. So this is the reason why for thousands of years we've had a ban on killing. Because remember what this bill is, it's a state licensing of a small group of people, that is doctors, to be able to kill with intent. Yes, with the consent of the person being killed. But guess what? Under the current law, if I agree for this person to kill me, that's no defence for her. It's a serious line to cross. And we've said in the past, even if you choose to be killed, the person who kills you still committed murder. There's reasons why we haven't crossed the line, even with the hard cases, of which, of course, there are always some requiring judgment and the mercy of the courts and the compassion of the families and people around them. Because once you cross that, you change the expectation. Of course it'll change the expectation of older people in rest homes. I was talking to a friend of mine in Canada who works in this field just after a couple of years, and she was telling us that patients in hospitals, older patients, really sick patients, are now starting to refuse drugs for two completely contradictory reasons. One is they're worried if they take the drug, say significant painkillers, that they will be regarded as losing capacity and therefore not able to choose euthanasia. The other reason is the opposite. They're worried the doctor might be giving a drug that's going to kill them. So you see, the choice for some people, however justified you think that might be, has, in this example, the effect of confusing the role of the doctors. In fact, I think it would be, if you were going to go down this track, take the doctors out of it, because they are the one profession in the world, one profession in our community, who are charged with and swear an oath to preserve our life, not take it. So get the lawyers to do it. Get the engineers to do it. It's not complicated, killing someone. In fact, it's so bizarrely quiet and easy that it'll rapidly become normalised. And that is why it is not possible to write a safe law. This is a complete waste of time. This is like the rules of rugby with no referee. This is just a set of forms that go in a filing cabinet. That is it. If you break these rules outside of the circumstances of actual murder, there's no consequence. One of the reasons that they look orderly, and actually the Canadian Supreme Court did not look at all the evidence, it took the word of a highly motivated judge of a lower court who didn't know what he's talking about. One of the reasons you don't have cases is because the people who provide the euthanasia are the ones who supervise the system. Another reason is because the principal witness is dead. See, you've got to think about, and people like Matt have to think about this because they get to vote on the law, right? Not on a competition for compassion, but the law. The law is the protector of the weak and the vulnerable. And in this circumstance, for instance, you need to think about what is an acceptable outcome? Well, I'd say it's this, the one we've always had. No one dies who doesn't want to die. Right? That has to be the benchmark. And we can't wave it off as there might be a few mistakes. Can we? We can't have some soft system where no one has a power to investigate or nail a doctor who's breaking the rules or find the difficult son-in-law who actually talked the mother-in-law into it, coerced her with stories about her past that he knew that he'd go and tell someone else in the family. Because right now that would be a crime. So if that could happen once, that's too often, because that could be you. You could be the person in the palliative care ward with the manipulative family member. You could be the person with the lazy doctor who thought, I'm going away for the weekend, let's just go and get this done and over with. Because there's no shouting and screaming with euthanasia. It's lovely, quiet, easy. In fact, my friend from Canada said one of the problems in the palliative care units now is the euthanasia is going on next door while you're saving a life here. Well, that's the reality. This is a death machine. So the standard is very high, and this is a waste of time because it's a set of forms. No one in here has any power to scrutinise any of it. They don't. Case in point. Another friend in Canada said, I knew the patient had dementia, but they don't have to come to me for euthanasia. They go to the family sent them to 2 other doctors who didn't know her, and they just said, oh yeah, you're capable because the family said so. Person got euthanized. She said, I'm her doctor. I understand dementia and the care of old people. That person had dementia and no capacity. Okay, so that might be a bit of a tragedy, but guess what? Nothing can be done because there are no consequences for doctors and families who break the law other than a murder charge. And here's another reason. So the principal witness is dead, confidentiality of medical records. You can't get a look at it. If that's your mother, you cannot see what happened. The doctor can't tell you. They're not allowed to. You can't access the records. How safe is that going to be? Someone has the ability to deliver death completely protected from scrutiny. And our courts have looked into this actually in the context of abortion. And our highest courts in New Zealand have made it quite clear they will never test a medical decision. That's why this legislation is framed that way. Whatever the doctor says, as long as they can show good faith, whatever that is, as long as they can show good faith, their decision can never be second-guessed, even if they didn't know the patient and had never seen them before. And the other little tricky bit here is that they'll do what's happened in Canada. They'll make the doctors' professional bodies do the dirty work. So in Canada, it's become a health treatment. Doctors now face the risk of losing their practicing licence if they won't participate, even though the law says they don't have to. So that is imposing on others. So there's 2 points here. One is, do we make these choices on our own? No. The choice to have the government give permission for someone to kill you has never happened in thousands of years, and your choice to do it, of course, affects everyone else, and that's why we haven't done it before. It's so dangerous. And the second thing is, can you make a safe law? Answer is absolutely not. Do not be fooled by this. It is simply bureaucratic box ticking. So I'm opposed to this because I don't want New Zealand to become a dangerous place for the depressed young, for the suicidal mother, for the weak, older, confused person and the disabled. And that's what will happen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. I'd now like to invite up the Right Honourable Sir Bill English for a 3 to 4 minute summary arguing against the end-of-life choice bill.
Look, I won't go over the same arguments, but I would invite you to support Matt, because for all the arguments, for all the polling, in the end, the bill is about not fundamentally compassion and choice. It's about the law. That is the black letter rules to enable people, like any other legislation, to live their life at the same time as protecting the common good. And if we didn't know there was a balance, we wouldn't have Matt and we wouldn't have the piece of legislation. And the legislation tries to look like it's striking a balance against this principle we've had for thousands of years, that killing's a bad thing, you never authorise it and you always scrutinise it. That's our culture, long, deep culture. It's a bad thing, you never authorise it and you always scrutinise it. And in the context of scrutiny, you can have compassion. You can have pragmatism. Our courts do that all the time. So that's the job Matt now has, along with his colleagues, to work out whether this is a law which will achieve a very high standard. Because if they don't achieve this standard, then they've allowed it. The wrongful death of someone who did not want to die. That's why I've always voted against this legislation. I've spent 30 years looking at legislation. You can't do it, and this is a very poor attempt. You can't do it. You cannot stand there in the Parliament and say, I've now made sure there is a euthanasia law that guarantees no wrongful death. So the proponents will have to argue either that it does, and it can't, rules with no consequences, or it has to argue that it's somehow acceptable, that a confused older woman who knows not much else except that if she gets euthanized, she's dead, in a moment of depression, says to a doctor, I want this, and is on the conveyor belt, changes her mind, something goes wrong, no one heard about it, or the doctors didn't listen, but no one knows that she ever said it, because you can't look. That's a high standard. I know it's a high standard. He can say, oh, you're just making up cases where things go wrong. Well, guess what? The law is there to make sure some things can't go wrong, and one of the things that absolutely cannot go wrong here is someone gets killed who shouldn't. That's one of the reasons we've got rid of the death penalty. That despite all the scrutiny of the courts, we could still end up killing people who shouldn't have died because they're innocent. So I'm opposed to it, and I've been in a political party where people have been asking for it for the last 50 years. That's the best reason to oppose the death penalty. Well, that's what Matt's got to do here. He's got to make some kind of silk purse out of this sow's ear. And I think it's going to be a challenge for the Parliament if they're honest about what this law is meant to be. It's not actually about facilitating choice. You can make the choice. Parliament can have no safeguards, just let you choose. It doesn't need to write rules to get choice. It has to write rules to protect the person with Huntington's who doesn't want to be euthanized.
Right, well, I'll end as I finish. There's really only one question. Should people have to suffer for the morality of others? And the two subsidiary questions beneath that. Well, the first was, is the status quo acceptable? Is amateur violent suicide acceptable? Is a bit too much painkiller, double effect, no consent, whoops, is that acceptable? Is people starving themselves to death, as we heard about from Gaba, acceptable? Just suffering to the bitter end. Is all of that acceptable? And I have to say, I don't think the other side really went there. I think they accept that for some people, for a minority of people, we've got a real problem. And then Bill took us off on what I consider a bit of a tangent about whether or not death affects other people. Well, of course it does. That's not the question. The question is somebody who is already dying and in great pain and suffering better or worse off if they have a choice? And what effect does that have on the people around them? And like many of these things, that's been studied pretty extensively. Overseas, where these things are legal, they have been for 20 years. And people have found that actually, by and large, the effect is positive because people like choice. They like being in control. They like respecting the wishes of others. So to the extent that that matters, it's an argument in favour of choice. But what it really came back to is it possible to design a law? And we've heard all sorts of scenarios, but I'll leave you, as I left you a little bit earlier, with the simple question: is the Parliament of Western Australia and Quebec and the Supreme Court of Canada and Crown Law in New Zealand all just completely wrong and have no idea what they're talking about? And Bill's actually right, because that is theoretically possible. Or could it be that actually the people that have most rigorously studied this bill and others like it around the world and come to the conclusion that it is possible to design a law where there isn't coercion, where people aren't affected, that actually those people are right, and that this is a choice that we can have? But even if you accept that, I'll finish with where I started, that this is a question of whether or not people should suffer for the morality of others. And tonight, Bill let it slip out. I don't think he meant to, but he let it slip out. He said that it's not suffering, there's intrinsic dignity. Well, that may very well be Bill's view, and I respect his view. This bill is about choice. But where he sees intrinsic dignity, other people see suffering. And those people are people who deserve freedom under the law. Those are people who deserve choice. Those are people who can have choice. And giving that choice is the compassionate thing for a parliament to do. And I certainly hope that your sincere local member of parliament in his deliberations will come down on the side of compassion and choice. Thank you very much, everyone, for being such a great audience and listening to all four of us go on for so long. Thank you.